Hi everyone, my name is Brendon Montgomery, and welcome to our masterclass. I'm really honored to have been invited here to Web Summit to speak, because I look forward to coming to the conference every year. First, I think each of you should get a pat on the back for participating in the virtual conference. I think if you're here at the masterclasses and you're out there at the networking, then it's really going to pay off for you. I'm speaking to you from the Netherlands, where I moved in 2019 to open Rangle.io. I come from Toronto, Canada, where I joined Rangle nearly 5 years ago to help solve a really interesting problem. How do we create evolvable digital experiences within complex enterprise environments? One lesson we've learned is how to cross the chasm between software development and design, and in that have stood up a world-class design system practice. I get all sorts of answers when I ask, what's a design system and what can it do for you? And it's not so much that the breadth of answers disappoints me, but it's that so many of them are incomplete because people rarely speak to the positive financial impact that a design system can have on their business. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about here in this masterclass. And to help me do that, I'm going to invite in a special guest speaker. He's led the creation of design systems for big brands like Amazon, Eastman Kodak, SAP, and most recently, Dick's Sporting Goods, the largest sporting goods retailer in the United States, where he and I worked together on their design system. He has multiple patents and design awards, including for his work at SAP on their design system, Fiori, which impacts over 125,000 screens. It has major, massive impact. He's been there, he's done that. He understands the financial impact that a design system can have on a business. Please welcome my friend, Michael Brown.
Brendon, thank you for having me. An amazing introduction. Oftentimes I forget all the cool stuff I got to work on. Thanks for having me, Web Summit.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you again, Michael, and thanks for coming along. Maybe to get started, you've been doing this a long time as a design executive. So what are some of the things that have changed since you got started?
Well, back in the day, design was in service to engineering. We provided the UI elements and specs. They'd go into huge documents. I think we called them PRDs. Then 6 to 12 months later, we'd evaluate if what we built matched what was actually usable. Agile came along about 10 years ago, and so did the evolution of design. And now we went from UI designers to UX designers, standing for user experience. What this meant was that we basically had shorter time to design, but we actually got to see the outputs quicker. And so we started to think about experiences, not just elements. Well, also with that change, I've started to see my organizations grow in size. This growth across engineering, product, and design also brought new challenges. Because see, what happened was each new member brought their own opinion. They would create a new solution, as designers do. That's typically what we think about, or approach. And oftentimes initially, we struggled to ensure consistency. So to address that, my teams would put into place these things called design language, which were basically a reusable set of stencils. Way back when they were in Visio, and then they would be in Illustrator, and now we put them in Sketch or Figma. But it allowed us all to kind of speak the same language. Every time that we as an organization would make a change, the designers would download the newest stencils, and we would send this over to engineers so that at least they had an idea of what it should become. But also, engineering teams got bigger, right? And so we needed to go beyond just a common set of patterns and actually have it attached to code. Because what we found is as teams became distributed across the globe, oftentimes the way that it would be implemented would be different. And so while it might look the same, it was different. And if that wasn't enough, then actual pressure from startups and online competitors came to us. And we can no longer just think about one channel. So it's been evolving quite a bit. But while we could used to be able to focus on our web experience, and then it was mobile, now we had to really think about omnichannel. And omnichannel is the big thing. And quite frankly, we have to look at how our experience translates across N number of platforms. So right now I'm seeing huge growth in companies, and especially groups that I've worked for, asking the question of how does our experience go from web to mobile to now voice, maybe augmented reality, kiosk, even cars. right? And so my team is constantly battling with how do we support consistency? Because customers expect a consistent conversation, whether it's on the web or in the car, but in a way that allows our engineering teams to deploy those experiences instantly. And so it was those type of challenges that caused us, and it's the point of this topic today, to introduce something that we call a design system, which really became more than just how does it look, but became a language of rules and flows and principles, more like a brand guideline than a set of elements.
So it's interesting in your story, you talk about how obviously creating digital experiences has become more complex. You also touched on how team sizes are getting bigger, both on the design and engineering side. And I have to think that that relates to the fact that I'm fielding a lot more calls about design systems. They've really grown.
Yeah, exactly. I am having regular conversations with design systems leaders from, service providers like Grubhub to information providers like Google, from consumer apps like Spotify and my friends in the enterprise world like at SAP. And let's look at Amazon, right? From Amazon online, a virtual experience, to Amazon retail stores. Companies are trying to understand how do they leverage design systems to align their resources to be more efficient on their spend and meet the customer expectations.
Okay, so maybe then just to step back a little bit, maybe you can talk a little bit about what goes into a good design system. So maybe the audience can picture what that is and maybe even think about how far along they might be.
Absolutely, Brendon. So first, it's probably best to explain what it's not and where it sits. So think of any application, whether it's a mobile or desktop or even a voice, as a stack of layers. The cornerstone of any modern app, it sits the data set, your customer data, your company data, your product data. This is your data, right? We all know this. That gets translated and leveraged into your business layer, probably written in Java, who knows, right? But then we talk about how's it being presented to your customers, or your employees, or your partners, and this is in your front end code. Maybe it's JavaScript, Ruby, etc. But all of this, all three of those layers, are actually determined by a set of flows and guidelines and a user experience. And that is the quintessential definition of the design system.
So then it's really so much more than the most common response I get back, which is it's a set of patterns and a website to host them.
Yeah, it absolutely is, right? If you just think of it as a series of stencils, the ability to translate your design system for multiple platforms is immediately eliminated. You'll need a design system for every single platform, and when customer expectations shift, guess what? You're building a new design language. Rather, a design system should be thought about in the same concept as interchangeable layers within that stack of the design system. So, if you hear me out, let's talk about what it is. And it's really more common to what you see in brand guidelines. So a design system starts off at the beginning with what are the principles and values that this experience needs to represent for your customers, right? So you may say, for instance, we need to have a simple experience. This was something we had at SAP. Well, those principles then go to your next layer, which is how are they represented and how do we hold accountability to those? Because if I told you, Brendon, tell me your definition of simple, it's probably going to be different than mine. So for instance, if we say, well, for us, simple is 113. It solves one use case for one person with no more than 3 steps, right? If we have that in our design system, as new experiences and new ideas come in, we can evaluate them against those rules, right? The next layer, as we translate those rules, this is typically what you see in the CX world, is the journey. What's the workflow that the customer is going to go through to solve within those rules and those principles, right? These are the pages. These are the specific feelings and emotions I have as I cross those journeys, right? Once we've defined that, then we can get into what is our tone and what is our content. So this might be ADA compliance, this might be language, etc. And then finally, how are those presented to a user? right? How is that language, that flow, those rules and those principles demonstrated on a voice, demonstrated on a mobile, a wearable, or a web, so that it's always consistent for your customer?
Oh, thanks, Michael. That's a really thorough definition. And I hope that's helping people to sort of understand and maybe visualize what this is, what this design system entity really is all about. But I also know what people are thinking. Wow, so to go down this journey to stand up a design system, this is going to take some sort of elaborate team. So maybe thinking about teams and the evolution of building teams, can you talk a little bit about how you resource, Michael, in the context of a design system, how you might start to think about your teams in a different way?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So once we've introduced a design system, the roles and responsibilities within my team become bifurcated. And it's not much different than what we see in a DevOps organization. So I have one part of my group that is managing the elements and the guidelines and the rules, the adherence and the training of the design system across the organization. What's different is we're actually bringing engineers who used to work on products, who now are freed up to be part of this design ops, design system teams. We're bringing those product managers in, we're bringing designers. And so they're kind of the governance side, if you will, very similar to DevOps. On the creative new experience side, where my designers used to focus on UI and look and feel, all of those are being defined by this design system. So now they're actually focusing on experiences. And this actually forced me to rethink titles within my organization and to move the prefix. So rather than have UI, UX, VD, whatever type designers, it's now just a designer who knows how to define experiences and workflow and leverage the system.
I like that you touched on titles. Always a controversial topic, Michael. But it sounds like you had a centralized design system team, which is actually quite common with some of the best design systems. But you also touched on how that really helps to streamline teams throughout the rest of the organization. So if we kind of make a leap from there, is it true to say then that a design system can really have organizational wide impact?
Absolutely. So when it's done right, the design system allows this product group, this design group, to completely shift the focus of not just what they're working on, but the whole organization. From one end of the spectrum as gatekeepers to the other side as innovation enablers, right? They're sort of in the middle now where they're able to help the business units get closer to solving customer problems. The way I talk about it, if you will, is in the metaphor of a car. Just hear me out for a second, right? So what I had historically seen was business units saw design, product, and innovation sort of like brakes. We were the ones that were preventing them from really solving their needs and meeting their goals. We were kind of keeping them back because of our crazy ideas or whatever. However, when I spoke to the teams themselves, they saw themselves as the steering wheel. They thought it was their job to define where the business went, merchandising, etc., that they knew how pricing or whatever might work. Well, the reality is when we introduce the design system, it's neither. The team moves to become in a position where they're seatbelts. They're helping the business units move faster, but because there's now guidelines and definition, we're able to ensure consistency, which ensures the safety of our experiences.
Okay, so it sounds like you're starting to get into the idea of experimentation. So maybe you can speak a little bit to how experiments can be run in a world where there's a design system.
Well, what it really means is that teams should target an ability to run an experiment. Let's just say any experiment. I want to prove that customers like blue hats, but they should be able to prove it within 48 hours. I shouldn't have to go through the old world where I create a strategy based on previous business data or highest paid person in the room. I roadmap it out, I get it built, and I launch it annually. I should be able to prove it in 48 hours before I spend the time investing it. So they should be able to test a hypothesis, old hypotheses, against radical new ones. Oftentimes what I find is that those old hypotheses, even though they might seem sound, were way off for where they could be. And even even sometimes the lightest approach towards those old hypotheses cost millions of dollars. So let's just say, for argument's sake, you want to introduce, I'll take a retail example, you want to introduce 2-day delivery because you believe your data says that customers will buy more products from you if they can get it in 2 days. Yeah, it seems like a no-brainer. I can look across the internet, everyone has 2 days. But you need to think it's going to cost a ton of money. You're going to need to put operations, facilities, distribution, of how expensive 2-day could happen. Now imagine if you could actually quickly roll out an experiment, 2-day, in 2 hours, to see did 2-day shipping or the offer of 2-day shipping impact customer buying decision. And if it didn't, imagine all the money you would have wasted had you chosen to go that path.
Yeah, wow. So the shortening of experiments. So the design system has the ability to sort of shorten the time it takes to run an experiment and measure it and see those results and then make a good decision. But maybe I can go back to a question that I receive all the time. So experimentation is great, but experimentation is creation, and creation itself is expensive. So how would you speak to why experimentation and creation is so expensive to begin with?
Honestly, this is the most ironic thing to it all. It's really simple. It's 2 reasons. So number one is it's really based on unfounded expectations on the cost to run an experiment. Look, an experiment is just an experiment. To test 2-day shipping doesn't mean you provide the capability for 2-day shipping for everywhere. It means you have the ability to see if people even want it, right? And oftentimes experiments are a lot messier behind the curtains than they appear. So I use the analogy of the Wizard of Oz, and I think Eric Ries does as well in the Lean Startup, right? Think about the Wizard of Oz. Dorothy and team walk into the grand room. It's clean, it's beautiful, it seems like it's been there for decades, and there's this huge mythical creature standing in front, right? But then they go behind the curtain, and it's a ball of wires and levers, and there's someone pulling it. Well, that's oftentimes what an experiment is when we first start. We're just trying to prove it. We don't need to make sure it'll work forever, right? So oftentimes I've worked in environments where the organization and my team is paralyzed by running this experiment because they weren't confident in that ability to reliably run the service in perpetuity, right? Like they didn't think, how are we going to keep this monster alive forever, right? It was silly, really. You might have to manually deliver on those promises at first, and it might cost you some more money than the ability to scale it up. But what you're trying to do is understand the viability of that option first. We want to not believe that we know what's right. We want to prove what is right. And then once we've proven it, then we can ramp it up in a revenue positive way. So when my teams consider experiments, we consider infrastructure costs, which just are not true. Once we get past that, next up is the cost to actually build the experiment. And it has to fit naturally into the company's existing environment. That's the real cost. How much will it cost us to do this? And how do we make this seem seamless to the user? And that just frankly is where design systems come into play the most.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Michael. And thank you for the explanation. And even with the Wizard of Oz analogy, as silly as it is, it really does help to sort of illustrate that. A design system can have a real impact on the way that you experiment, something that's important to each and every organization that is part of this masterclass today. And it's a key insight to take away. A design system is fundamentally a way to manage the cost of creation. It's a meaningful elevation from a tool that just enables creation. So with a design system, every euro or dollar that you put into digital product development is used more efficiently. So less of that budget is burned to produce the same outcome. So then take it one step further, Michael. How would you go about proving the ROI of your design systems?
Well, see, so it's just that. Oftentimes, when an innovation or product or design group is thinking about ROI, we're thinking about revenue growth, beyond even revenue recognition. We're thinking about how much net new contribution do we have to the company's top line. I use the time saved to launch an experiment as an initial starting point. Meaning, we can start by looking at how long would it take to launch an item on our strategic priority list. And then I say, okay, well, we've cut that from 6 months to 48 days, just as a starting point to kind of get some value. But in reality, that just talks about how long did it take for us to learn customer behaviors. The real gains come when we start to talk about the savings from running experiments that didn't go the way we wanted, hence the 2-day shipping, right? I leverage those to talk about, quite frankly, that is the value of the design system. And those are the learnings which are more valuable to the organization. And had we invested too much money in infrastructure or other logistical costs, right, we would have not been able to focus on actually meeting customer needs. But, that's my background and that's my experience. Brendon, let me ask you something. So,
Sure.
So who are you finding is actually interested in design systems? Like, I'm seeing it sort of shift in responsibilities. Is it still only large organizations that want them? Like SAP, we have 125,000 screens. Dick's Sporting Goods, we have 3 different brands. Like, who's coming to you for these design systems?
That's a great question, Michael. And you're right. Early days, design systems were primarily for retail organizations. And it makes sense because they're multi-channel, multi-language, multi-brand. The complexity was really suited to it. But now that we're seeing experiences in other industries share that same complexity and the expense going into creating it. And we're creating design systems for banks and insurers, manufacturing, telecom, and even airlines. And that's been the most exciting part about our design system practice. That design systems aren't just a retail solution, they're a digital solution for anybody that's creating digital experiences. And as part of that, it extends to the engineering organization, to the CIOs and CTOs and engineering leads. So I want to ask you, Michael, as a design leader, a design system is usually born within that design group. How do you go and have conversations with your technology colleagues about what you want to do?
Honestly, Brendon, that's the crazy thing. I find the most resistance from design and product because it challenges who they think they are. Engineers are completely on board with the design system. Quite frankly, I find a great approach is to typically hand off the design system to the engineering group. It fits into their existing DevOps approach and strategies. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, the biggest benefits come to the engineering team.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Michael. I mean, the DevOps approach, I really like that sort of comparison. One last final question for you. We can't hide that there's investment to stand up the design system. There's an initiative that has to take place. So what advice could you give the audience on how to go about having those conversations around budget and getting budget allocated towards this purpose?
So the best place to start is to conduct an audit, to really understand how many pages, how many touch points are you trying to impact? And then across those touch points, measure for inconsistency. How is it 10% that the same element is being built differently? How often is it compliant, incompliant, various other things, but you want to measure inconsistencies across. Then we translate that into how much time we spend to build an individual control. So of the total product time, is it 5, 10, 20? I've even heard it up to sometimes building front-end controls takes 60% of the total development effort, right? And so we take the percentage of the problem across the number of screens times the total amount of effort, right? And then we're able to calculate a target for how much money we could spend. And then I try to back that in to say, of that, 10% investment into the design system to solve 40% of that problem. So if we're spending, if we're wasting $2 to $3 million in development, a design system becomes a no-brainer or whatever it might be.
Well, fortunately, this brings us to the end, and it's time to wrap up. So thanks again to Web Summit for inviting us to the masterclass. And thanks to each of you for coming and learning how a design system can have a positive financial impact on your product development efforts. I guess there's one obvious question that's left, which is, Are you a good candidate for a design system? Is a design system right for you? Well, here's a few things for you to think about. To get the biggest impact, you need to be delivering a lot. So ask yourself, in your organization, are you delivering a lot of front-end solutions? Are you delivering across different channels and formats? And are you multi-brand and multi-region? If you answer yes to all of the above, then you start to become a really obvious candidate. But if you're still unsure or want to learn more about the financial incentives, you can contact me at Rangle, and I'll take you through our design system canvas. That's going to give you some facts and figures and indications if a design system in fact aligns with your organizational goals, and we'll tell you how to get started. And if you have some questions now, Michael and I are ready to start to take those.